Hello, everyone, and welcome again to Deep Humanism. I'm James Croft. My guest, as always, is Andrew Copson, the Chief Executive of Humanists UK. How are you doing this week, Andrew?
I'm fine. I'm a bit tired. I've been trimming hedges, enjoying the... sounds like a euphemism, but it isn't. I've been actually trimming actual hedges in the garden because it's the first day of spring, really, isn't it? It feels like it anyway.
It feels like the icy grip of winter is finally giving way.
It's
We
coming
have
back
some lovely...
next week.
Yes, life is returning. Yeah, I've seen the stories saying that it's going to get cold again, but for now, I'm reveling in the sweet winds coming in and warming up the world. It feels magnificent.
Excellent.
We have two really fun topics for you this week. The first one being it is the 5-year anniversary of the COVID pandemic. And today, as we record, I understand, has been designated a sort of day of reflection in the United Kingdom. And we're going to share our reflections on COVID from a humanist perspective. And our second topic is an intriguing new YouGov poll that suggests that young people are increasingly open to belief in God. That one's an annoying one, and I can't wait for us to get to it. But we're not going to start with that. We're going to start with COVID. So Humanist UK was invited to be part of this day of reflection.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about what that is and what Humanist UK has done?
Yeah, the National Day of Reflection is an opportunity roughly 5 years on. I mean, it's sort of the beginnings of the pandemic had many anniversary dates that we might date things from, whether it was the first cases in the world or the first cases in Europe or the first cases in the UK or the beginning of restrictions or the beginning of lockdown or whatever. But, it's roughly 5 years since we all started worrying. And the National Day of Reflection is a government-inspired day, but it's been led also by commissioners on COVID reflection, who include people who've been particularly bereaved or responsible for particularly difficult areas of public life or sectors, including healthcare during the pandemic and since. And it's an opportunity, obviously, to remember those that have died, but also to be grateful to those people who got us through it. And Humanist UK was asked, as many groups in the country were, to participate in this day of reflection. So what we did is we had a small ceremony this morning for our own people. So but not everyone might know that Humanist UK has about 1,000 people working front lines in different ways: funeral celebrants, wedding celebrants, pastoral carers in hospitals and prisons, universities, university chaplains, and others who were, of course, affected in particular by the pandemic. And lots of our members also volunteered. I'm pleased to say a third of the members of Humanist UK volunteered in the pandemic in various ways, which we're very pleased with. So this morning we had an opportunity as humanists to have a ceremony that was meaningful for us. We actually did a ceremony during the pandemic as well. I don't know if you remember it. In June 2020, Alice Roberts and Jim Al-Khalili and Mark Gatiss and Joan Bakewell and lots of other humanists took part in a recorded ceremony that people could watch in their own homes, which at that point was not a reflection on the pandemic in the past, but was about getting us through it. But the same messages were quite evident this time as they were 5 years ago. We talked about fortitude and the way that a lot of people had shown such amazing resilience under these circumstances. We talked about the way that, although we were physically distanced, in many ways we were connected as never before, online and in our thoughts for each other. And we also talked about the fact that, and this was my contribution to the ceremony in 2020, there are always pandemics. But this time, quite unusually in the history of the world, it was not an existential event. Human beings in the past have had civilizations wiped out by pandemics, completely destroyed. That hasn't happened to us. Although things have changed, at the time was difficult and things have changed now. In fact, one of the things that's remarkable is how much of the nature of our civilization has remained the same. We're built on hospitality. Hospitality's come back. We're built on the arts and public life. That's all come back, and so on and so forth. So, we haven't been destroyed by this. And through the hard work of scientists and the joint human endeavour, we've come through it, and our civilization has not been destroyed by a pandemic in the way that would have happened a few hundred years ago. So all those same messages this time round, added to which, of course, this year was our recognition that it's not over for lots of people. People are having long drawn out symptoms. We've got our own people in Humanist UK sort of workforce who suffering in that way. And many people still also feel grief and resentment and anger at the way that the pandemic was treated by people in authority, the inequalities that it exposed, the way in which some people were left to go to the wall, not just in our own country, but globally. So fit all of that into a 25-minute ceremony to bring people together, and that's what we were doing today.
It sounds like a very intense event, and there's so many elements that I'd love to dive in deeper with you. But to begin with, in case people are thinking to themselves, a humanist ceremony, what on earth could that be? Like, can you give us a sense of the structure and the content of this so that people get an idea of what humanists might do collectively in response to events like this?
Sure. Well, I mean, you may be a better describer of this than I am, given that you obviously crafted many humanist ceremonies over the years as a more active celebrant than I. But I mean, obviously any ceremony that takes place within a community is built around the beliefs and values that are shared by that group, that community, even if it's just the community of a moment that comes together for a wedding or a funeral or whatever. The space that you hold in any ceremony is one that's composed of shared beliefs and shared values, and the things that you do obviously are the things that give significance to events based on those beliefs and values. So obviously the examples for humanists is that this is one life. This was a very precious thing that both accentuates loss in terms of the people that we've lost, but it also, of course, gives hope. Reason and evidence, and approaching things with a commitment to finding out and to solving problems. I mean, that was very evident during the pandemic. So, of course, we were able to dwell this morning on just the enormous effort that went into bringing us out of it by so many people and by the organised enterprise of science. Brave, courage, love. I mean, these are shared values, of course, with people of different worldviews, including religious approaches to life. So we talked about that, had contributions from people's own memories, had poetry that illuminated these particular themes. We weren't able to have music this morning. In 2020, in the ceremony we held during the lockdown period, we had the Humanist choir all singing sort of in harmony from their own different homes in screens. That was incredibly beautiful on that occasion. We didn't have that this morning. We had a moment for personal reflection, of course, where people could be inside their own minds, although together could take the opportunity to think or just feel whatever they wanted to in the moment. During that moment this morning, some people held up photos or the names of those people that they loved and had lost. Some people lit candles. Some people just gave themselves a sort of hug, or hugged the people they happened to be with if they were in their homes with others during the ceremony this morning. So mixtures of elevated language and verse that gives a heightened emotional sense, actions that have a ritual aspect or a performing aspect that allow us to channel our feelings in that way, and then a sort of communal aspect. We didn't have any sort of because we were all online, there wasn't any communal aspect in that sense, but there was a feeling of community. I mean, what would you say gave humanist ceremonies their shape and form?
I think you've kind of put your finger on the main aspects. For ceremonies like this, I feel like there are three central things. Firstly, they are communal in the sense that they are opportunities for a community to come together to recognize some shared experience, whether it's an experience of loss or something that people are celebrating, like in a wedding, but something like this is something that affected basically every human being on the planet. So it really is a profoundly communal experience, and it's an opportunity to reflect that by coming together in a physical or virtual space at the same time to say we've all been through this and it affected us in various ways. So they're communal. The second element that you brought out, I think, really well is that they are centered around shared values, not just shared experiences, but shared values in response to experiences. How did people in this instance reflect who they were, who they wanted to be, and what they wanted society to look like by how they acted in the face of these particular challenges? And in the case of a humanist ceremony, obviously that's going to be the humanist values that we care about, like a commitment to truth, reason, and science, a commitment to fellow feeling and the welfare of everybody in society, regardless of who you are, a particularly sort of internationalist outlook, not forgetting that this is impacting other countries much worse than us and things like that. So the shared values is the second key piece. And then the third thing, I think, when you were talking about the music, the poetry, these heightened symbolic elements, is its way of encapsulating or presenting those values in a symbolic form that gives them emotional resonance, that makes people really feel them. Yeah. And that was the thing that I really enjoyed myself when I was leading a humanist community. I really enjoyed the process of being creative with trying to find ways to symbolically represent what this community believes in. And I think, from a humanist perspective, that is what religions are doing. There's actually nothing. People sometimes think that there's something. Well, how could humanists possibly have a ritual to respond to COVID? Well, actually, what we're doing is exactly the same thing as a Christian community or a Jewish community, a Muslim community, or whatever is doing in response to these things. We're trying to find symbolic resources to reflect the values of a community in response to a particular challenge. That's exactly what everyone's doing. We're just using slightly different symbols to represent slightly different values and beliefs.
I think that it's a good point that you make about every human being is doing this. It's is there a society anywhere, either in the world today or across history, where we're not aware that they did something ceremonial to give meaning and significance to events? No. Whether it was religious or whether it was secular, the common thread amongst between all those things is being human. As humans, we do things to give significance and meaning, to express the significance and meaning that we've given to events. I think that's right. I think that and this is, I think, is a very popular way of doing things today. There's a reason why humanist funerals, humanist weddings, humanist baby namings, and so on are so popular. It's because of this need, which not being met by religious organisations because people don't have those beliefs, is met in another way. And I'm always struck by how diverse those expressions of meaning, how personal those expressions of meaning are. In the humanist funerals in particular, there's so many different actions that people get inventive about and want to do. There was one man whose his grandchildren and his great-grandchildren, because he had many of them, he was well known in the family for allowing them to draw on his walls in crayon and felt tips when they went round to his house when they were little. All of them had a lot, I think. And so as part of the funeral they had together, all of his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren wrote messages in felt tip on the coffin as they, before they left. And it was just, obviously,
That's
it was
lovely.
Completely personal to them, completely, absolutely. The resonance was just for them. We feel it, obviously, now that I've described the context, but they must have felt it even more so. And, there's just hundreds of examples of those that we can give from humanist ceremonies, aren't there, where, a humanist celebrant working with the people involved have co-created something that is as meaningful as it could possibly be.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
There's something really freeing, actually, about not having to stick to a particular framework, a particular liturgy or set of readings or symbolic activities. And I've certainly found that in working with people who, when I've conducted a memorial service for someone who's died and worked with their family to create something, or a wedding ceremony or a baby naming, as you say. I was very disappointed when I did my first baby naming to discover that I didn't get to choose the name of the baby. I thought that was the whole point of me, but sadly not. Yes, I would have called it something appropriately humanistic. But actually, in that case, in my first one, the parents named the baby Science. So that was pretty amazing.
Very on brand.
Yeah, it was very on brand. I didn't have to do any work to fit that into my value system. That was amazing. So the creativity that you can express when you are free from the necessity of having to do things in a very delineated way can actually make these experiences much more personal and therefore much more meaningful, because you often I'm sure you've experienced this. You do a humanist wedding and people say afterwards, oh, that's the first wedding I've ever been to that actually felt like the couple being married. Right? I felt like I knew them. It happens all the time. I would have, yes.
Someone comes and say, oh my goodness, it's the first funeral I've been to that really felt like it was about the person,
yes,
who died.
I would even often have that experience because I was leading a humanist community in quite a religious part of the United States.
Yes.
I'd often work with people whose family members were very religious, and they would often express during the process some real anxiety about the fact that it wasn't a religious clergy person doing the work. And afterwards, universally, they would be like, that's the best wedding, that's the best funeral I've ever been to. Yes, yeah, it was really extraordinary.
Who are religious, of course, will get the same thing out of their own religious ceremonies too.
Yes.
Equally, had a family member say, well, I'm sure you did the best you could, but I'm a Catholic and it wasn't a full mass, so it didn't mean anything for me, and I'm like, okay, so I'm sorry. But a lot of other people can. Well, in fact, humanist ceremonies aren't just for people who have obviously a humanist worldview, although so many people do have an implicit humanist worldview in our country now that, people get a lot out of it anyway. But I remember that when they can be inclusive, of course, of all people, and in fact, lots of humanist celebrants, as you know, take care often to be inclusive of all people. I was invited, coming back to the COVID thing, I was invited, I can't remember exactly when it was, a couple of years ago now, to lead the NHS ceremony for NHS personnel who had died during COVID. It's a very unexpected invitation, actually. And I almost think it might have been a mistake, because they usually have these things led by the Church of England. And in fact, the next year, the equivalent ceremony was led again by the Church of England. And I was disappointed that this happened. But there was a lot of pressure on me, I felt at the time, not to do, as it were, a humanist ceremony, because we had there the chief execs of all the NHS bodies, the chief nursing officer, all the heads of the NHS sector bodies, as well as working clinicians. And it was in East London at a new flower memorial garden that had been set up. So I was in a position where I had to have a whole, undeniably a humanist invited as chief executive of Humanist UK to come and lead this humanist ceremony. And it was a really interesting challenge to have to be a humanist, lead a humanist ceremony, but one that was completely inclusive. And so I focused entirely on what everybody shared. And instead of saying this was a belief that was, this was a ceremony that was entirely about humanist beliefs and values, I said that this was a ceremony motivated by a belief that humanists have, but is shared with many others, which is that our common humanity brings us together and we all have certain shared values. And of course, it was a short step from there to the values of the NHS and the values of the the values that people in the NHS and social care systems embodied, of care for others, of courage and kindness and fortitude, all the rest of the stuff that you talk about when you talk about that. So that was okay. But I definitely felt like I was navigating a fine line, but I felt I could do it, and without any wish to criticise the religious ceremonies. You can if you want, but without any wish to criticise the religious ceremonies that followed it in the years before, the years since. I do think that a person who attended the humanist ceremony would feel more at home and comfortable than a non-Christian who attended the Christian ceremony, to be honest.
Yes. I'm sure that's true.
It was led by a Christian priest, and there was praying to God, a God that most people there didn't believe in, or believed in a different God or whatever. And although people were invited to give readings from different traditions, it was very much sort of invited in rather than a ceremony that was built entirely on the premise of what we had in common. So I do think that, humanist ceremonies are not only good for humanists, they're sort of good for everyone.
I think before kind of coming back to COVID more specifically, I'm going to take this opportunity to kind of plug one of the ideas behind this YouTube channel and why I wanted to call it Deep Humanism, because I think that there's at least two ways of thinking about humanism. One of them being as a worldview perspective that sits alongside other worldview perspectives like Christianity and Judaism, etc., and that occasionally agrees with them and occasionally disagrees with them and wants a seat at the table, an equal seat at the table, which is a very good way of looking at it. But I think there's also another way of looking at it, which I think of kind of conceptually as deep humanism, which is something underneath all the religious and non-religious philosophies of the world, which is the human desire to make sense of our experience and to navigate this life that we all live, regardless of what we think about any other life we might have. And that when you start thinking of humanism like that, as getting underneath the metaphysical convictions people have and the ideas people have about God, to the fundamentally human concerns that gave rise to theorizing about God and the afterlife and metaphysics in the first place, there's something there that's very universal. At least that's my perspective. Of course, that is also itself a particular perspective that not everyone shares. But I do think that there's something very powerful there, and that I'm sure that in your ceremony, in your service, that it came out.
Maybe, yeah. I certainly.
You sound skeptical.
Well, I'm slightly skeptical. No, I'm not skeptical. Well, okay. What I'm not skeptical about in what you just said is that there are these two obvious things: humanism as a distinctive approach to life, which might overlap or conflict with other perspectives of life in different ways, and then something else, which is a baseline universal humanitarianism that people could share which gives rise to thinking about this. I'm not sure it's useful to use the same word.
Okay, well, we can fight about that offline while I try and think about
Why
my book that
offline?
I'm writing about this. Well, but we can have an episode about it. The reason I don't want to do it now is because I want to dig in a tiny bit before we move on to our second topic into the experience of COVID for you and for sort of humanists in general, because I found it particularly challenging in both a really inspiring moment to be a humanist and a really depressing moment to be a humanist. Inspiring because of the extraordinary scientific and technological achievement, the international effort that suddenly kicked into gear that developed a vaccine in record time, and the willingness of people to put aside all sorts of petty allegiances in order to do something for humankind. Very inspiring. And then seeing in many places quite a successful and quick rollout of this vaccine, like really human beings working together, doing their best under impossible circumstances to help the community. I was very proud of the human species as a humanist in one sense. And then on the other side was the extraordinary science denialism and conspiracy theorizing and the politicization of everything, particularly living in the United States as I
Living in the
was.
US at the time,
Yes.
yeah.
Seeing how whether people even believed COVID was real would break down entirely on political grounds, you know, with Democrats and broadly kind of liberal-minded people being like, yes, obviously this is real and we need to take it seriously. And, you know, Republicans and more conservative-minded people much more likely to be like, oh, this is a hoax that's made up by people to stop us going to the shops, and which is things that I heard people express, like views that I genuinely heard people express. And not just that, but, you know, the wacky cures, the ivermectin, which is still a thing that people are promoting. And just that was incredibly depressing alongside, I think, in many places, the widespread failure of governments to really get a grip with that. You saw Boris Johnson be basically completely useless. You saw Donald Trump being completely useless in response to it. So it was very depressing also. And I kind of had a strong tension in me about how I experienced it as a humanist. How about you?
Well, it's a big lot of things to experience all at once, isn't it? I mean, my own personal experience was slightly niche. I mean, I was a member of the government's moral and ethical advisory group on pandemics, which was formed just a year before the COVID pandemic happened, and then kicked into a completely different gear once the
perfect timing in a way.
I know, perfect timing, right? So, although not perfect timing, because that advisory group actually, I think this has been come up in the inquiry actually, was convened in the belief that the next pandemic would be, an avian flu type pandemic. So it's a bit different. But, that gave me obviously a very interesting experience, weekly meetings with Cabinet Office officials and Department of Health and Social Care officials, and really interested in that. So that was an interesting experience. And then, of course, I was running an organisation, national organisation, whose celebrants suddenly couldn't do funerals or marry people, who were very affected by the sudden legal changes that were happening under the emergency regulations, that had to think a charity that reliant on donations, and that for the first time in my 20 years working at Humanist UK, in the first couple of weeks of the lockdown, we received no donations, which is the first time ever that there's a week had gone by without any donations, probably in 100 years. So, like a lot of voluntary sector organisations, we were existentially panicked, and so I had experiences like that, which probably gave me a particular view. I don't think I feel in a position to judge Boris Johnson or the government's response.
You're so kind, Andrew.
I'd be interested to hear why you think he did so. Why did you think he did badly? I mean, like you say, the UK did better than many other countries. I think that it did. The whole experience, if I were to sum up what I took from it, firstly, I really need to see performing arts live. That's one of the things I felt.
Same.
And I swore during the pandemic I'd be never out of the theatre once we were allowed to go again. And in fact, I have lapsed into irregular habits on this, and not going out as much as I should. But that was important. And Other than that, I think that the things that what I took away from it was, yes, okay, human beings are pretty good, but what I took away from it was how good social democratic liberal states are. The administrative state is such a gift to human civilization. The state that is capable of enforcing quarantines, directing research, rolling out vaccines, running large social care and health systems, and growing them at scale, although they turn out even if they turn out they're not to be needed, the capacity has been created. I was impressed by the state. It made me happy in that way.
Maybe I need to rename the podcast Deep State Humanism.
That would be a good for your conspiracy commenters.
Yes, they would love it. The commenters, by the way, who we've got we have had quite a lot of comments on our discussions. I don't know if you've been seeing them, but we are annoying quite a lot of JD Vance and Trump supporters who don't like what we're saying. So if you're listening right now, we love you. We care about you. We hope you're having a good day. Obviously, we disagree about some political things, but underneath all that, we're all human. Can't we all just get along?
Yeah. So I did think that at the time, maybe this will lead to a great new embracing of the liberal social democratic state, like the Second World War did, right? So one of the reasons why you have, I think, such a flourishing of social welfare and the NHS and all the rest of it. Yes, the Labour Party is in power in government after the Second World War, but also people finally realise that the state can do things. It can win a world war. It can organise markets and everything else so as to be able to win a world war, and it can really get stuff done. And I think I thought maybe after the pandemic, people will feel similarly. Oh, the state can really do things. It can really sort things out. Maybe it'll carry on sorting things out. And remember that the UK state, kept everyone in a job through funding the furlough scheme and things like this. And so I think that I was hopeful that it might lead to a burgeoning of the liberal state, but it didn't, of course, as we know now.
Yes, and that's a discussion we can continue for another time. But I really appreciate your perspective on that, because my view of things was not you were working at a national level with advising governments, and I was working at a very local level, though I was on our ethics advisory board for the mayor of the city of St. Louis.
Well, that's important in the US, isn't it?
It was a very interesting experience. It was very amusing how it happened, because they initially announced that they were having this advisory board to the mayor, and they said who it was, and it was all men and all Christians, and that produced a lot of pushback. And I think in response to that, they invited everybody they possibly could. That's the only way I snuck on there. But I had the experience of really seeing maybe the other side of the coin, which is how profoundly dysfunctional government can be, and how they would set targets for, we will reopen restaurants if we hit these transmission benchmarks, and then they would not hit them, and then they'd reopen the restaurants anyway. And so we'd go to these meetings, and I would say, well, last month we said we'd hit these targets, and if we hit the targets, then we would do this. You've gone ahead and done it, even though we haven't missed the targets. Why have you done that? And there wouldn't really be an answer to that question. Right. Well, have we given up on the targets? Yeah. Well, no. They're still on the website, right? There's still, it felt like a complete disconnect between what was actually happening and what politicians were doing. And it felt like they were doing what they wanted to do for purely political reasons, rather than because they were focused on what the evidence was telling them. And it was very frustrating, not just to see the government doing that, but to be really the only person in the room willing to say,
really,
you said you would do this, you are not doing that. Why is that? And to just feel like everybody really just wanted to be liked by the mayor. That was honestly my experience. So I kind of made me less, I think I became more cynical about government, sadly. But I should think more thoughtfully about a sort of cross-national comparisons, and particularly types of governments, as you say, and how they fared.
Benchmarking it against as well. I mean, what are you benchmarking it against? Periclean Athens and the plague there, or the flu, the influenza epidemic, or China, where they locked everyone up in their homes for months and months and a year. I mean, I think these are difficult questions.
Yes.
It was very interesting to participate in the Moral and Ethical Advisory Group at the time, because, of course, these questions were in sharp relief. The balances between individual freedom and public good, and some of the more complicated balances that at the time didn't get the ethical airing that they deserved, like, for example, the long-term consequences of closing schools, the long-term
Yes.
consequences on mental well-being, the long-term consequences on society of
Yeah.
a lot of the fracturing of relationships that was being forced by government policy. I was particularly keen at the time on thinking more about, why exactly it was that a 90-year-old husband couldn't hold his dying wife's hand after 60 years of marriage and had to either be at home or behind many glass sheets. I mean, I thought that didn't make sense. There had been an insufficient consideration there of the individual human well-being.
Well, that brings us back to something we discussed in earlier episodes about the complexity of ethical issues and the willingness within humanism to try and find balances and to appreciate the different ways things
in agreement with the Roman Catholic member of the Moral and Ethical Advisory Group, interestingly.
Well, that's a very good thing to feel, to sometimes sense a sort of solidarity of values in places where we don't necessarily expect it. I think that can be broadening. And it's a really good way to transition to our second topic. Because we are going to talk about God. And particularly a recent YouGov poll. Well, in fact, it's an ongoing YouGov poll. They do it every year. And they basically ask people about their opinions about God, their opinions about religion. What do you believe? And this most recent one, to my immense frustration, I'll tell you why, not real frustration, just play frustration, has shown that there does indeed seem to be an increasing number of the youngest cohort of people in the poll who are willing to say that they believe in God, and a decrease in the number who say they don't believe in God, and also the number who say they don't believe in God, but they think that there's something higher. And that is in a...
Can I just say...
okay. Is it not all right?
So there hasn't been a decrease in the number... there hasn't been a decrease in the number who don't believe in God in the latest poll. There's been a slight increase again. But what there's been another decrease in is the number of people who say they don't believe in gods, but they do believe in some sort of spiritual higher power. That's important because it might be that those people, there's a sort of a transfer from spiritual power to God. In the short,
I'm frantically pulling up the poll right now
because 18 to 24-year-olds.
Yeah, 18 to 24-year-olds. Because I'd looked at that and I had thought that I had seen, 18 to 24-year-olds. We're looking on the YouGov poll, okay, and we're looking right now.
Okay.
I do not believe in a god or gods, but do believe there's some sort of spiritual or greater power. That's at 11% now. Yeah. It's gone really down quite a lot over the past few years.
Yeah.
I do not believe in gods or any sort of greater spiritual power. You're right, that's gone up.
Yeah,
this is much better news. It's gone up to 34%.
It's complicated news.
And I do believe there is a god or there are gods, and that's gone up to 45%. And the thing that everyone's pulling on, so, okay, just some context, people. We've spoken about this before, particularly in different videos. But there's a narrative going around that the UK and the West in general is experiencing a rebirth of the belief in God. Hello, Justin Bryle, if you're listening. That's what his book is all about. And my constant refrain in response to this claim from apologists and right-wing politicians and all people who are excited about this is that there's no evidence of that. There's no empirical evidence of that whatsoever. And they are never able to provide any empirical evidence at all when they're challenged. And now they've got a little bit of evidence. And it's so annoying because I do have to say, from August of 2022, right, you're looking at a point where I'm trying to use the poll. 19% of 18 to 24 people said that they believe there is a God.
Yeah.
And in the past 3 years, less than 3 years, that has gone from 19 to 45%.
Yes.
That is a very big shift.
So I think that we should remember what we're talking about here, which is that this is not people changing their minds. This is new people coming into the code.
Yes.
So if you
humans,
new
growing.
Yeah, that's right. So the kids are not okay from our point of view. But I think that is important to remember. So the that the idea that somehow society is experiencing a reconversion, or a revival somehow, that people who didn't used to believe in God are now believing in God. I think there's no real data to support that.
Well, just let's pause there for a second, because I'm looking at the data for all adults now.
Yes.
And it is quite interesting. So since 2019,
yes,
significantly fewer Brits say that they believe in God than say they do not believe in God. So back in 2019, 26% say I believe in God.
Yes.
And 41% said they don't.
Yes.
And in the last year, in January of 2025, for the first time since 2019, more people in the UK say they believe in God than say they don't believe in God. Of all people.
That's true.
Yeah, that same poll. So it's in January, the lines crossed, and there's been a sharp dip since last year in the people who say that they don't believe in God, and a corresponding, almost exact increase in the number of people who say they don't.
Yeah,
they do.
But the huge impact is obviously being had by younger people.
Yes.
And of course, that's both young people, as it were, growing up, and immigration. Immigration is an enormous factor in these figures over the last few years. We've had extremely high levels of immigration into the UK over the last few years. Very high levels of immigration, and of course that affects things too. So that's particularly illustrated by the London figures on belief in God. Now, for the first time since this data started, most people in London now believe in God, 55%, right? And 6 years ago, it was 26%. So it's a huge leap up from 26 to 50. So one of the things about urban areas like London, of course, is that there are very large numbers of people whose ethnicity corresponds with Christianity, like Afro-Caribbean or African people. There are large numbers of people from ethnic groups whose ethnicity typically correlates with Hinduism or with Islam, of course. That's the biggest of the non-Christian religions. So I think without doubt you're seeing a big effect from all of that.
Right.
So I think it still doesn't mean that people who were previously non-theistic are becoming theistic. The biggest determining factor in whether or not you will believe in God, as we know from a big research project that's just completed at the University of Kent, 3 years, led in part by an academic called Lois Lee, who we both know, who's excellent.
Yes, Lois is wonderful. Hey, Lois, hopefully you've subscribed to Deep Humanism.
And she will, I think, disagree with this research, which we'll come on to maybe in a second. But one of the, as her research program showed, that the determining factor as to whether you believe in God or not is whether your parents did. And so, no doubt what we're seeing is people coming into the 18 to 24 age bracket in this poll who are the children of religious parents.
Right.
Religious people are having a higher birth rate than non-religious people, and that's probably a large part of it. The other large part of it, as I say, is probably we can correlate it with ethnicity and with immigration, and that effect in London is huge. To go in 6 years from 26% of people believing in God to 55% of people believing in God, and for London to be the most religious place, as well as it has also become in that time in the UK, is quite big. I want to say 2 things though about this data that is important to remember, as well as the fact that it's mostly new people coming in, as it were, whether by growing or by immigrating. And the first of those 2 things is that this is not about religion. So religious data is still showing the same sort of decline as it always did. So if people are asked, do you see yourself as belonging to any particular religion or denomination, the story is still the significant growth of those saying no, to eventually, and quite soon, if they haven't already, and they probably have, become a majority. They have become a majority in some questions. So this is not about religiosity. This is about people who say, I believe that there is a God, or there are gods, or that they don't believe in any sort of God or spiritual power. Now, the question matters as well in that context. So this isn't about religion, and you could make a case saying it's not even very accurate in terms of a belief about God either, because if you say you don't believe in any God or higher spiritual power, what are you really saying? It's a very contestable statement. So there's that. And then the other thing to say is that it's possible this data might just be wrong. So the big national opinion poll that was done and survey that was done by Lois Lee's research program, for example, showed that there are still more people who don't believe in God or probably don't believe in God than who do or probably do. And her question is much more sophisticated because it doesn't just have these sort of three quite limited decisions that the YouGov poll has. It's a wider range. And there, you can see in that more sophisticated research that most people don't actually believe in any God in any meaningful sense that we would say. Nonetheless, there is something happening. There's no doubt about that. We can't deny it. 18 to 24-year-olds in this poll, and certainly the vast majority, it seems, of people who live in London do now say that they believe in gods or God. And this is a new development. It seems not to be linked to any particular religion. It is about belief in God or gods. And I personally, of course, find it quite worrying because there's plenty of evidence that people who do believe in God or gods are more politically conservative. And that's a threat for many people's human rights and other aspects of the liberal society that we cherish. And also, from some research surveys, of course, there's evidence that people who do believe in God are less rational in other ways. And if you believe in an active democratic citizenship that makes rational decisions on behalf of all of us, personally, I think it is a worry that more people, and a majority of people in some places, now say they do believe in God. Of course, they might change their minds.
They might. I'm thinking I'm going to put two hats on here. I'm going to first put my chaplain hat on and say that my personal feeling, and I've been a bit flippant about being annoyed by this data, and I'm actually not really annoyed by it. I think it's amusing that people have been making this argument for a long time without any real empirical data, and when it comes and it supports it kind of makes those people feel like they were right all along, when in fact they still weren't right to advocate for something without support for it. Now they can write a book saying that there is an increase in belief in God if this data is correct among certain parts of the British population, but you shouldn't write that book before this data comes out, okay?
Unless your plan is to create a stampede through false information in your claiming this is what's happening. That's
what I will go on to say. But I personally am quite relaxed by what people believe about God. I work very closely with many people who believe lots of different things about God or gods, and it doesn't exercise me in any particular way. I'm much more interested in the ethical values that they think flows from their particular religious perspective, and that's where there might be some tension. That's my sort of chaplain hat. But putting on my spent 8 years at Harvard doing a doctorate, including quite advanced statistical methods hat, which is not the area of my research eventually went in, but we all had to be trained in how to design a survey and how to do statistical analysis of large data sets and how to read the analysis of others. And I studied that for years. And I think that one thing that you said that I think is so important is to really look at things like, what is the actual question being asked? How might people interpret that question? How does that differ from questions other researchers are asking in the same area? What is the sample being used for this? How big is it? How representative is it? How are they sure? How consistent is this data with other sources of data exploring similar questions? Like you really have to be sophisticated in your approach to this data. So one thing that I think is really interesting about this data is that what seems to have happened just from a cursory glance at the graphs is that, over the last year or so, year and a bit, there's been a significant decrease in the number of people who are answering don't know or I don't believe in God, but do believe there's some sort of spiritual greater power. That those who have gone down, and that the I do believe in God has gone up. And so has, as you correctly say, I do not believe in God, right? That almost some sort of polarization effect is happening where people are getting off the fence, as it were, or a new generation is less willing to be uncertain about their beliefs about this and is being more definitive. But it's not that a bunch of atheists are turning into theists. That in fact it's that sort of agnostic position that is dramatically declining in this data. So that's one interesting thing to think about, why that might be and whether there might be political and cultural factors that are affecting that. And I feel like there is something, I mean, obviously, a lot of the people who are promoting the idea that there is some sort of rebirth in belief in God or faith or interest in spirituality and religion are people who want that to be true, who have a direct vested interest in making that the case. And I do think that because, unlike other demographic markers like one's race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, etc., our religion is responsive to reasons, right? Properly thinking, at least, we should be able to change our minds about our religious beliefs. And the cultural shifts, I think, can play a role in changing how people self-identify and how they answer questions about this. So I actually do think that it is quite smart, if you want to create a religious revival, to talk all the time about how there is one. Like that it actually does work to create a narrative, and that there is something that I kind of respect in a way, the effectiveness with which that narrative has been promoted, because you do see it all over YouTube. It's tons of podcasts. Yes, it's got a lot of support.
Yeah, I think that too. I mean, I agree. And there is no doubt at all that that's exactly what has happened in the last few years, especially online. And I suppose that this 18 to 24 cohort are very online, a lot more than the older cohorts anyway. So I think that's probably right. I was writing something about this just very recently, a short article about, this so-called meaning crisis, and which we talked about before, and we don't want to talk about it again. Or maybe you do, but not today. This so-called meaning crisis, and the way that many of those writing about that, who also are trying to, at the same time, put about this idea of a religious revival, are blatantly trying to just cause a stampede in their direction by this constant reiteration of this stuff. And it's very effective, and I think probably it's happened many, many times before, certainly in Western history, maybe all over the world, I don't know, but certainly it's happened in the religious history of the West many, many times before. And it happens in advertising all the time. Have you heard about the new product that 30, 40, 50, 60% of men your age are now using to deal with this problem or that problem? Like, 60% of men my age?
Yes.
I must do that too. I mean, pathetic, really. Or at least it can disappoint you about human nature to realise that sort of effect is real. So, yeah, you're right. And
It's something I felt a little bit in my teaching at the university when I occasionally go into philosophy of religion classes and teach a session on humanism, that I do get a sort of pushback occasionally from one or two students that I don't recall receiving when I used to do that in the States at different universities in previous years. Like over the last 10 years, I feel like younger people are starting to ask different types of questions and really ask some challenging questions about, well, what people think of as kind of standard apologetic responses to humanism, like how can life be meaningful if this is all that happens and there's no, result to it ultimately, and questions about the grounding of morality, like, really kind of Jordan Petersonian questions occasionally coming out of the mouths of these young people. And I have to give credit to the people who've promoted those ideas in the culture, because it's working. I do feel that, by the way, I tend to respond to them with intelligence, wit, and charm, and that they're immediately won over for the cause of humanism. But they are starting from a place of skepticism, and it's interesting to feel that shift happen.
I think that's true. It's definitely something in the wider culture. I think that culture isn't the only thing that matters here. I think that if you're looking at this 18 to 24 category cohort in this data, you've got to remember they've lived through a time of enormous insecurity and uncertainty, economic, social, lots of disappointment on the horizon, everyone believing that the world's, going to hell in various different ways, environmentally, in terms of war, in terms of politics, in terms of the economy, in terms of their own prospects. Also, if you think about 18 to 24-year-olds when this survey was taken, they'd have been 13 during COVID when it started, to link up to the thing we were discussing earlier. That must have had a strange effect on them as well. Even the oldest of this cohort would have been 19 when it started. So who knows what their experience has been weird. Their experience in terms of the experience of everyone else in the last 40 years, where the data is much more similar in the different generations. I mean, there's fluctuation, but the gap's not nearly so wide as it is with these people, or so against the previous trend. Obviously, weird things have happened to people who are currently aged 18 to 24, and or living in London. That it's just no doubt factor into this. So I don't think, if the one thing this data doesn't do is show that there's any sort of religious revival. It certainly doesn't do that, because if you were expecting a religious revival, you would expect to see this sort of effect in every generation, in every part of the country.
That's interesting.
And you'd also expect to see it not just in data about believing in God and a higher power, but in something about religion. And
yes, right.
Separately from this, religious data, of course, isn't showing this trend at all. But nonetheless, you're right. It's maybe the people who are putting their time and money into manufacturing a revival will end up achieving it.
And that ultimately is why this channel exists, to engage in that same cultural conversation, but from a different perspective, from a humanistic perspective, where we think that this life is the only one we have. We have to make the best of it. And that's okay. This is enough. So, Andrew, I know you have to go. Thank you so much for joining me. It's always a pleasure to chat with you about these deep and important topics about life. And if you want to hear more of this, just hit the like button, give us a subscribe. We've had extraordinary response. Like the growth of this channel has been remarkable compared to most channels, and you could be a part of it. You could be a part of the overwhelming percentage of young people in your area who like and subscribe.
18-year-olds love this channel.
Absolutely. And if you haven't watched it yet, just before this video came out, I did my first YouTube collaboration with a Gen Z creator called Elliot Bewick, and I hope I'm saying his name right, but he's great. Elliot's great. We talked about tons of questions about religion and Generation Z and how it's affected them. And so you can find that on his channel. I'll link it in the description. Thanks for joining us at Deep Humanism, and I'll see you in the depths. You were supposed to join it. You're never going to do it, are you?
I shall never say it.